Welcome to video lecture 10 in this series of discussions about St. Thomas's teaching on the one and the many. In this lecture I'm going to continue a theme that I've been discussing for several classes now, of relating St. Thomas's teaching about science to his teaching about analogy and analogous predication, and how that relates to his study of a genus. The nature of a genus, once again, for St. Thomas is pretty much what we today would call an organization. And I'm increasingly, as I go through the next several lectures up until the end of these video lectures, and also in the transcript, I'm going to be simplifying for you St. Thomas's teaching in terms of more contemporary language, which will make it easier for you to understand. But if you don't understand the technical language that he used and how I more or less have gone through this reasoning process to unpack it and to update it, you're not going to get as complete an understanding of the greatness of his thinking and his teaching, as well as much of what Aristotle contributed to it. The current lecture is going to concentrate on three main topics, three general topics: how the knower and the thing known constitute one genus, or belong to one organization, to update the language, and how this relates to science being a hierarchy, and that theme or topic of how science or philosophy is hierarchical relates again to analogous predication and to different powers that human beings possess, that are scientific powers. So we get into another topic of how the human being is a first principle of science and philosophy, which should be evident to anyone, but to a large extent it does not seem to strike home to many people that science, philosophy, is an act caused by an individual, a human being. Before I get into talking about those topics, which today we're going to treat in chiefly through 6 questions or 6 subtopics, I want to go over the 5 topics of discussion that we went over in video lecture 9, just to review them for a little bit. And so that you'll get them as a kind of segue into what we're doing today, especially the last question that we dealt with there. And the first question that we considered the last time in video lecture 5, and I'm going to look down at my notes a little bit to review this, but my recollection was that the first one dealt with analogy, the connection between analogous predication, philosophy, science, contrary opposition, and contrariety. Well, this once again had to do with how contrary opposition requires unequal possession, right? And privation of some common principle, a common matter, as St. Thomas calls it, and that unequal participation involves an unequal possession of unity, or greatness, what St. Thomas calls intensive quantity, greatness. That's why I focus attention on that notion of intensive quantity, and why it is that if you don't understand St. Thomas' teaching about intensive quantity, you can't understand his teaching about science and philosophy. Or analogous predication, because analogy presupposes unequal relation, and talking about a multitude in relationship to or in reference to unequal possession of some common genus, or if you're talking about individuals, some common species. Within those 5 questions, I then considered St. Thomas and Aristotle's teaching about our first awareness of measure as a quality. For St. Thomas, a measure, for Aristotle, a measure is the means of knowing quantity. Right? Now, quantity for Aristotle and St. Thomas can either be bulk quantity or intensive quantity. It can refer to greatness in a dimensive sense of bulk quantity, or in a sense of number, big and small, more or less. And in either case, whether it's virtual or intensive, it's referring to some sort of inequality, and inequality is a kind of unity. In talking about how we first come aware of our notion of measure as qualitative, well, according to Aristotle, what we're doing is we're transferring, and St. Thomas, we're transferring the notion of unity as a measure. And even unity as a measure, we come to understand in a certain way on the basis of quality. In this case, the awareness comes from a comparison within an individual, or considering an individual having different intensities of possession of some common subject. For example, a child who's sick, whose temperature is greater than it had been just shortly before, or over some extended period of time, or a person who's lost or gained weight. We first are aware of qualitative possession of measure in relationship to the individual and with respect to more or less. As far as the qualitative possession of unity, you recall that for Aristotle and St. Thomas, this has to do with the quality of unbreakability, of indivisibility. That's how we become aware of the measure of unity in a thing, which is, in a way, its measure of quality. But the quality of the unity, here what we're doing is we're measuring in a sense, the quality of the quality, the intensive quantity of the quality. According to St. Thomas and Aristotle, the only way we become aware of that is in relationship to the individual and the intensive increase in the individual of possession of some common subject about which we're talking. If we want to compare this to somebody else or to some other thing, what we have to do is to use a standard of quantity. And we have to notice somehow or other that this has been affected. We do this with respect to using a thermometer to test a person's temperature, and we can give that thermometer, if we clean it off, to someone else and then compare it. We can use a balance scale and compare weights. And we can also do this with respect to other kinds of activities, and we use quantitative standards of quality then. We use intensive quantities, like when we compare the excellence of a performance, of a theatrical performance or a sports performance, by the applause. A beauty contest, for example, another one. So we use this intensive quantum standard of measure as an examination of the greatness of something in contrast to the greatness of something else. And in doing that, what we are doing is comparing unities. We are comparing an intensity of possession of unity. This is very important to understand, because in the division of the sciences, what we're doing is we are comparing and contrasting the intensity of possession of unity, or the greatness of the measures, the intrinsic measure within the thing. The the division and the methods of the sciences, as well as the way we hierarchically divide different individuals and species, depends upon this recognition of inequality of intrinsic measure. So all art and all science, in their hierarchical divisions, are based upon unequal intrinsic measure of unity on the part of the thing known and also on the part of the thing knower, which is one of the reasons why we're going to take a look at this contrast between the thing known and the thing knower in relationship to measure in this video lecture 6. So I talked about St. Thomas and Aristotle's teaching about equality and inequality in relationship to virtual quantity and in relationship to dimensive quantity in the last lecture. In this examination, I also went over how we use these different measures in the fourth topic in the last class to compare and contrast inequality of measure in relationship to audience reaction, and also in physics using balance scales and things like that, and how Aristotle and St. Thomas used the threefold division of measure into sameness, similarity, and equality as measures of internal strength, as revealing an inequality of the measures, as well as they'll use them as an inequality in a way of the measurer, to come up with the division and methods of the sciences. So you can't understand the division and methods of the sciences without understanding, in a full sense at least, without understanding inequality of measures, that we're using different standards of measure to come up with these inequalities. And in doing that, what we're doing is recognizing an inequality in divisibility, an inequality of strength, that there's something greater about essential unity that makes beings that are essentially connected stronger and more difficult to divide, and scientific analysis chiefly focusing attention on grasping essential unity, that accidental unity of properties like quantitative and qualitative properties do not manifest the same kind of strength, but quantitative properties of strength, because they are distributing internally and externally to some extent the form of a thing and its operations that the qualities depend on, so that they can exist and operate, is stronger. And qualitative properties display a kind of unity, but not as strong as quantitative unity and substantial unity. All right. So, having reviewed that, those 5 topics, I'm going to get into the first 3 topics of the conversation for today. And the first is how the thing known and the knower constitute one genus. They do this in as much as they are extremes of a relation, and that the genus is unequally distributing a relation in a way through various species, going from the lowest to the highest in relationship to the common aim of the genus. Now, if you think about the genus in terms of an organization, this becomes much easier to understand, that the act of scientific knowing puts the thing known and the knower into the same organization. We're engaged in an organizational activity of unifying one act of knowing in a single understanding. That's the aim, and that's what we want to achieve. And what is being known and the knower becomes separated from a multitude. And now become part of a common activity, just as when you have a multitude of human beings who have now been organized into some sort of a team or some sort of a business or some sort of an organization. This all happens on the basis of their being in some way intellectually unified. It's in relationship to the intellectual operation that is either seeking speculative or practical or productive fulfillment or satisfaction that these individuals become part of a human genus that's a productive or practical or speculative activity. A lot of times we don't think about something like basketball or bowling as an intellectual activity that contributes to the members, the individuals becoming members of a group or of an organization. But it's precisely because they share the same intellectual aims that this multitude now has been unified into a group. Now, this does not mean that you always have to have intellectual unity in order to have a unity of organization. But it is the case with respect to human organizations that are formally, that are essentially differentiated or distinguished on the basis of intellectual operations. That without those intellectual operations, you don't have the genus. It's not the same case when you're talking about biological operations, like the operation of health, or of becoming, a member of a plant genus or an animal genus. But nonetheless, when forming a genus, you have to pay special attention to what distinctive difference creates that organizational unity that makes this organization different from all other organizations. So the knower and the thing known depends upon the measure in the thing known and the measuring power of the intellect. To the extent that these are unequal, the sciences are going to be unequal. The kind of measure that you have internally in a thing is going to determine the necessity of unity that the thing has, and necessity is an essential characteristic of the subject of a science. The thing known has to contain within it some sort of intrinsic necessity that is expressed by a kind of necessity of judgment in the mind of the knower. And so the knower is going to be contributing different acts of abstraction that are going to change the mental activity and the intensity of the mental activity, give it a greater intensive quantity that's going formally to distinguish it from less scientific mental activities. We don't like to think in these terms of hierarchy today, in terms of science, but that's because we think of science in terms of a logical system and not as a habit of mind, and we don't take into consideration the intensity of the power that has to be exercised on the part of the mind. According to St. Thomas, science in the thing known has to consider a formal object. If you remember, a formal object considers whatever is acting on a thing to be acting on a power, so as essentially to make it operative. Like color activates the faculty of sight, and St. Thomas says the subject of a science is related to a science the habit of a science, the way the formal object is related to the power that it activates. So there's a formal aspect in the sense that there's a causal difference, right, in the thing known that contributes to the complete unity of the science. And there's also a formal aspect in the mind. What does that mean? Well, there's a certain quality of unity in the mind that the mind is contributing, right? So that what activates the intellect, where science is chiefly located, is not complete. Is not completely made evident to us by the external senses. Color, we see through the external senses being activated by the color in the thing. But what activates science is this intrinsic measure of unity that escapes the notice of the external senses. It's only by some internal activities that the external senses don't notice that we become aware of that. Like the mathematician sees a kind of unity, a causal unity of organization, an organizational unity that the external senses don't pick up, right? And the metaphysician picks up an essential type of unity that the mathematician doesn't pick up. Well, it's that organizational unity that's the formal object that activates the faculty. And it's not present to the human intellect without having to pass through these other faculties. So it comes through the imagination. And the dematerializing power that the imagination has and that the intellect has. What St. Thomas calls the agent intellect. So until that operation happens to a physical object, there's no formal object of science in the intellect. It comes earlier in the process to the person engaged in physical science, where the imagination operating in the way it does, like it does for ordinary experience for every human being who's reached a certain level of development as a child, is able to exercise. But that mathematical abstraction requires imaginative intensity and maturity of development that you just don't get from that type of ordinary type of use of the imagination. It requires a more intense focus of attention and concentration and power on the part of the individual. That dematerializing power that's required for metaphysical reasoning to be able to grasp measures of unity in things that escape the notice of the mathematician require even a greater intensity than the mathematician possesses. St. Thomas distinguishes the scientific subject from the scientific knower based upon the intrinsic measures that each possesses, measures of unity, and the way in which each is unified by those measures. And there's a complementarity. Right? While he distinguishes them, they're two terms of a relation, two extremes of a knowing-knower relation. Unless you have a thing known, a unit measure in the thing, and a power capable of being able to be activated by it through conductive media in between, you can't possess science. And trying to explain this process is very very complicated. The third topic in the list of the three topics I'm going to discuss in this first section or this first video lecture 10, is on what the knower contributes to completing the formal object of scientific knowing, in contrast to the thing known. Well, what the knower contributes is the knower's measuring power. dematerializing power. Science consists in a dematerializing power, an ability, a habit, by means of which a person is able to apprehend a kind of unity and necessity that exists in things due to a power of concentration and focus of attention that a person without this ability simply doesn't possess, because the person has not developed the qualities of imagination and the qualities of memory that accompany them to be able to apprehend the unity that exists in things. As Galileo says, to advance scientifically, you have to stretch the imagination, and this requires qualification of a faculty, of an immaterial faculty, so that it's receptive. It can become a proper conductor for activities that it can't conduct without this qualification. Much like you cannot burn wood. It's not going to receive the flame unless it's first qualified by heat. The reception of a unifying principle through causal activity always requires some sort of qualification of the subject that's receiving to enable it to become a receiver. This is why businesses constantly want to know the qualification of applicants for a job. Because without the right proper qualifications, they cannot become part of this organization. When the flame becomes part of the wood is now inflamed. It's an internal organization that has a different kind of operation that is going on within it, that it could not have had and might not have, if it were a person, certainly would not have want to have within it. But I'm going to leave off on that right now. Welcome back to Video Lecture 10, the second part of Video Lecture 10, where we're talking about St. Thomas's teaching on the one and the many in relationship to the division of the sciences and the methods of the sciences and the hierarchy of the sciences and of the divisions of philosophy and how these relate to the knower and the thing known being part of the same organization. I went over three topics in the first part of the lecture, talking about how the knower and the thing known are part of the same genus. And I want to go back to that a little bit again, just to emphasize the fact that the knower in relationship to the thing known, the organization known, and the knower is an organizer of the organization known, and is in a sense an organization, just as much as an organizer. What I wanted to talk about was the fact that the knower is both the act of knowing, is an intellectual activity that involves the intellect as a receiving power, or St. Thomas talks about it as a passive power as well as an active power, like the faculty of sight is passive in as much as it's being acted on by color, and then it reacts with the act of seeing. The act of seeing then being the final cause that satisfies the faculty's principle, its own nature, and completes it by holding on to its, staying in touch with its formal object, what causes it to be active, because everything that exists seeks to remain in existence according to its power. So there's this natural desire upon faculties, once they are united, to what activates them to stay so united according to their strength, according to their internal power. The human intellect reacts to what it receives in two stages, one conceptually, and then according to an act of judgment. And so the dematerializing power of the intellect involves those two special activities of conceptualization and judgment. And a lot of thinkers never get beyond this conceptualization stage. People who are interested in the tradition of philosophical investigation. St. Thomas's teaching focuses on judgment, and it does so more than any other thinker within the history of Western culture that I know of. And this dimension of judgment and the role that judgment plays in all of the arts and sciences and all of in the hierarchy of sciences and philosophical divisions is something that few students of St. Thomas realize. Many realize that it plays a terrific role in metaphysics, but it also does so in each of the divisions of the sciences and the divisions of philosophy. It's related to a dematerializing power, as I've indicated before, and so is this a conceptualizing power. And so the hierarchy of the sciences is going to be based upon this dematerializing activity involved in conceptualization and in judgment, and how independent this is from dependence on the subject that is being known. The more dependent it is on being in contact with and requiring the input of the external object, the less it is an intellectual activity, and the less it is scientific. So, getting back to the first of these three questions that we're going to deal with here at the moment is why mathematics is more scientific, more philosophical than physics and classical physics, and metaphysics more scientific than mathematics. The reason is, as I've just indicated, because of the internal organization, right, that is being studied, and the way it's being conceptualized. St. Thomas talks about the fact that on the person who is investigating, studying something as a physicist does so like a person of common human experience, and using the external senses, and deals with efficient causes and final causes, focuses attention on those, and so is going to focus on those as being the cause of operation, and that's what it chiefly is interested in, wonders about the unity that gives the organization to something that makes it operational. But there's a prior interior type of organization that gives the thing its unity, and upon which that external operation depends. And that's not the chief focus of interest, of attention, of the person who's engaged in the physical sciences. But it gives to a thing being studied a greater internal measure of strength and indivisibility. That's why the mathematical laws or the principles that are universal to the study of modern contemporary physics are so crucial to understand, with respect to analysis and synthesis of physical objects, with respect to the way they combine, they can be unified and broken apart. Because when you know the principles of unity of a thing, when you know the proper way to measure the things, to come to know them, you know the way they are put together and can be can be taken apart, can be divided. The more dependent something is on a principle of unity, the stronger that principle of unity is, that unifying principle is. And so this then becomes a key to understanding how the mathematical principles become a key to understanding how to influence operations and activities in the physical universe. So the mathematical concepts tend to be more abstract. They don't have to focus attention. They can leave out of attention the qualitative differences upon which the unity and the operation, the activity of externally sensible things depend. But as St. Thomas says, you can't leave out of the definition, the concept of what you're thinking about as a mathematician, that there is an internal organization, that a kind of matter, as he calls it, a common matter, that the mathematician studies, the geometrician and the arithmetician. So you have to think about that material unity, that kind of unity of place and position in relationship to mathematical measurement. That the person who's engaged in ordinary experience by means of knowing the unity of things and their internal possession of unity, the strength of possession that they have, of the kind of unity that they have, is something that does not focus attention on what the mathematician is focusing attention on. The cause of unity, recall, is something immaterial. It's a qualitative characteristic that prevents something from being broken apart. And the person of ordinary everyday experience is focusing attention on how to keep operational unity, preventing activities, operations from being divided and somehow being able to maintain unity, whereas the person in mathematics is concerned more about the dimensive kinds of unities, ones that relate to geometrical figures and relations of geometrical bodies, for example. But still, that's a kind of internal unity that gives a qualitative strength to a material. I've talked about Galileo previously, about how Galileo, as a mathematician, when talking to Venetian shipbuilders, was able to recognize the kind of unity that comes to a material object. In relationship to resistance and receptivity of operations. That is something that escapes the notice of geometricians because they don't focus attention on that. And so they couldn't teach him those principles that he needed to know in order to come up with his new sciences of combining mathematics and physics. It escaped their notice. They weren't interested in it. It's not that they weren't intelligent enough to understand it. Certainly they could. But they weren't thinking about it. And in the same way, metaphysicians focus on a kind of internal unity, a measure, right, which escapes the notice of mathematicians. But it's even more universal in scope in its influence, because it influences all organizations. In a sense, this is one of the great discoveries that Father Charles Bonaventure Crowley made when he recognized that metaphysics has as part of its study a philosophy of measure. In a sense, it consists of two disciplines or two philosophical studies combined or unified. One, a philosophy of measure, and a philosophy of operation, or a teaching about measure and a teaching about operation. And the key to understand the differences of the sciences and the methods that we study, by means of which we study them, is to recognize that those intrinsic principles of measure give to these external principles of operation, and even internal ones like moral activities, a certain type of a strength and unity that is of a qualitative difference. The qualitative difference of the unity of a metaphysical sort was the type that I talked about in relationship to the way God possesses existence. That it's a more simple and less composite possession, more perfect and complete, so that existence is possessed all at once whole, and is possessed in a stronger way. So eternity is a measure, and in the sense that it not only puts an internal limit on possession of existence and gives it a kind of greatness, it also gives them a strength, a resistance to it, divisibility. So the now of time, which is the measure of divine existence, the now of eternity, which is the measure of divine existence, is different from the now of time, which is the measure of finite existence, because it's the means through which we know the quantitative greatness with which existence is possessed. And a measure tells us the quantitative greatness of something, and so is something, it's an idea, a concept that we derive from qualities and from understanding qualities, and then transfer them to all of the different disciplines. And that's why Aristotle says that we can't demand the same amount of certainty from a subject of study dealing with qualities like we do the amount of certainty we get from a study like mathematics, or like we get from a subject like metaphysics. Because metaphysical principles apply to all organizations. They tell us the means through which organizations become unified, and how one becomes stronger than another. Mathematical principles don't do that with respect to all organizations, but they'll do it with respect to all organizations that are subjectified within extended bodies, bodies that have dimensions, and they will analogously express the way in which those operations that these bodies engage in can be described by means of mathematical principles. And so analogously, they will tell us a truth about the nature of things, but they won't do so directly. They'll do so indirectly, and we'll have to engage in a kind of negative reasoning and use different kinds of models to translate them first into mathematical language, and then retranslate them into language of ordinary everyday experience. Right? The fifth question, the topic I wanted to talk about, was the why the formal object of that makes a science or a division of philosophy a division of philosophy or science as such, and one that makes it speculative. This is St. Thomas talks about the the fact that a formal object is that by means of which you basically identify the activity of a science. And trying to figure out the difference between a scientific object and one that makes it a division of science is very complicated. It took centuries, millennia, for someone to figure out how this is done. And one of the reasons why this is difficult is because of the fact that very often we identify speculation with guessing, and if we don't make that mistake in thinking about the way St. Thomas is talking about speculative, we identify speculation with abstraction. Great students of St. Thomas have done this. And I think Jacques Maritain does this in many times. That's why Maritain has trouble understanding practical knowledge, because he thinks that practical knowledge, in order to be scientific, has to be speculative. And he comes up with these very strange terms and talking about science as being speculative, practical, and practically practical, and how you get from one to the other. But what makes a science speculative is the fact that you're thinking about something, you're interested in it, you're wondering about it just from the standpoint that you want to understand its organization. You want to know how it's put together and how it can be taken apart. And what makes it practical or productive is that you want to understand that organization for the chief aim of putting it together or taking it apart, right? In either to make a product or to unify, organize some sort of internal activity like your reasoning faculty and logic, or just developing a liberal art of perfecting your speech in rhetoric, or learning how to write or to read. What makes the science a specific division of science is the subject being studied, right? It's a different formal object. The organization being studied, right? And the way it's activating your habit, whatever habit it is, a mathematical habit or a habit of the physicist, requires a different unity to come into being, right? It requires different qualities of soul that are being activated. So what's activating the quality of your soul so that you know something speculatively, right, is the desire to know the organization as an organization. What makes that speculative science to be physical rather than mathematical or metaphysical is the organization in the thing, the internal measure that you're considering, right? And the habit of mind that you're using to consider it. That habit of mind is speculative, but it's speculative in a specific sense. What it's doing is it's taking that organization of thinking, judging, reasoning, and conceptualizing that is proper to any kind of speculative way of understanding, just trying to apprehend the organizational makeup of something, and it's focusing attention on this measure of unity in this physical thing over here. You could do it with respect to understanding a bowling team or a plant. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about an art. You can understand. You can study something like music in a speculative way, and you can study it also in a practical way without thinking about the speculation, because you have the talent to play. So there are nuances of difference, but because of the fact that internally there are different organizational principles, the level of certainty that you can get from the subject that you're studying is not as great, right, from study of physical organizations, because they're more difficult to penetrate, they're more difficult to comprehend, and being less remote from our intellectual apprehension and having to go through this process of external abstraction, whereas the mathematical principles are easier in some respect to apprehend directly. And the metaphysical principles are easiest in a way to apprehend, but they require, like Plato observed centuries ago, that we develop habits of abstraction that can focus our attention on dematerializing qualities of things, of organizations, just considering organizations as organizations, right, rather than operational organizations or principles that can generate operational organization. So finally, how philosophy is a personally caused act. I think that having shown the contribution that the human mind makes to completing the formal object of a science, by making it either speculative or practical or productive on the one hand, and also the way it abstracts the concepts and judges them, it makes this intelligible. The judgment that the scientist is making is going to be concluded in that faculty that is able to present the intellect with the proper image through the human imagination, by means of which it can apprehend the nature, the organizational unity that the thing has, and it judges its own judgments in and through that faculty, because that's where it finds that nature with the assistance of the imagination, completing the circle, basically. If you can't form the images that you need to understand the nature in question without the assistance of the human imagination over and above ordinary imagination, and in addition to that, you need extra activity to negate those images and make them immaterial. You're going to be doing metaphysics, and you're going to conclude your judgments in the intellect. If you don't have to go that far, but you have to go beyond those qualitative characteristics to understand the dimensive kind of unity that a thing has, and you can only do that with extra work on the part of the imagination and you apprehending a figured body and focusing attention on that, then you've got to verify those truths in the imagination, because that's what gave you the image, the adequate image to understand the nature. And as far as ordinary, everyday experience, well, you verify, as we say today, empirically, but that's a misleading notion once again, because it's only the intellect, in conjunction with other faculties, that verifies in the final act where it concludes its judgment, or people actually do, through the intellect in relationship to a faculty. So the person is that principle that is generating the knowledge and giving the understanding. And for this reason, science it chiefly exists in the individual human being. And a person is a first principle of scientific knowing. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this class.